The rain had not stopped for 3 days. The river behind the fields had swollen, and the muddy road leading to the small village shimmered like a sheet of brown glass. Diep stood under the thatched roof, holding a woven basket filled with corn she had just harvested. Beside her, little Nee sat quietly on a small wooden stool, her bare feet swinging above the puddles. "Stay here, Nee," Diep said softly, brushing the girl's damp hair from her forehead. "I'll go borrow a scale and a bag. Then we'll take the corn to the market." Nee nodded with a tiny smile. She always listened to Diep. The two of them had been together since the storm washed away Nee's parents' home a year ago. Diep was not her mother, but she cared for her as if she were. At the market, the smell of wet soil and steamed corn mixed in the air. Diep's voice rose among the crowd, gentle but full of hope. "Fresh corn, only 20,000 a kilo." Her words carried kindness, and soon a few women stopped by to buy. One of them bent down, smiling at Nee. "Such a polite little girl. Helping your sister," Nee bowed shyly. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for buying our corn." When the last basket was empty, Diep wiped the sweat from her forehead, even though the air was cool from the rain. "Come on, Nee. Let's stop by Mrs. Hyen's house. It's been a long time since we visited her." Mrs. Hyen, James's mother, was a gentle woman who had always treated Diep with warmth. James, her son, was a man of few words but deep eyes, a CEO who somehow never let his heart harden like the world expected. He had met Diep months ago, in a local charity project, and from then, something quiet but powerful began to grow between them. Diep took out her phone and called. "Aunt Hyen, it's Diep. I'm nearby and wanted to visit you with little Nee, if that's all right." The older woman's voice came bright through the speaker. "Of course, my dear. Come right away. It's been too long. Stay for dinner, all right? I'll cook something nice for you and Nee. And James will be home soon too." Diep smiled. "Thank you, Aunt. We'll bring some fresh corn as well." By the time they arrived, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The cozy house glowed in the dim evening light. Nee sat watching television while Diep helped Mrs. Hyen in the kitchen. The scent of ginger and lemongrass filled the air as they prepared dinner together. Mrs. Hyen looked at Diep fondly. "You've become like family, Diep. You take such good care of that little girl, and you've been strong through so much. James is lucky to have someone like you." Diep blushed slightly, focusing on the soup in her hands. "Aunt, please don't tease me. James and I were just friends." Mrs. Hyen chuckled, her eyes gleaming. "Friends can turn into something more. Sometimes a mother just knows." Outside, thunder rolled again. Mrs. Hyen picked up her phone and dialed James. The call went unanswered. Her smile faded into a line of worry. "The rain must have made the road worse," she murmured. "I hope he's all right." Minutes later, the phone rang. It was James. His voice was calm but distant. "Mom, the road is blocked by a landslide. I'll be late. Tell Diep and Nee to stay at the house tonight. It's safer there." When the call ended, Diep's chest tightened slightly. Something about the storm, the flickering candles, and the worried look on Mrs. Hyen's face made her heart ache. Later that night, as they sat down for dinner, Mrs. Hyen smiled warmly again, though her eyes glistened with thought. "You know, Diep," she said, setting down her chopsticks, "once this rain passes, I've been thinking of holding a small family ceremony. Something simple, but special. Maybe a wedding." Diep froze. "A wedding?" Mrs. Hyen nodded, her voice soft but full of meaning. "Yes, for you and James. You belong together. I can see it in how you care, and how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." The room went silent except for the whisper of rain against the roof. Diep's fingers trembled slightly as she glanced toward the window, where darkness pressed against the glass. A wedding? Her heart beat faster. Could that ever truly happen between a man like James and a woman like her? Outside, somewhere beyond the storm, James was still making his way home, and inside, under the trembling light of a single candle, Mrs. Hyen's words lingered like a promise, or perhaps a question that fate would soon answer. The storm roared through the valley until midnight. Rain lashed the windows, and the wind rattled the roof tiles of Mrs. Hyen's house. Inside, The lights flickered every few minutes, and the soft crackle of the fire in the small kitchen became the only steady sound. Diep sat on the wooden floor with Nia asleep in her lap. The little girl's hand clung to her sleeve, her face peaceful despite the thunder outside. Across the room, Mrs. Hyen folded blankets and glanced toward the window for the 100th time. "He's late," she murmured. "The road must be terrible." Diep looked up, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the candles. "He said he'd come. James always keeps his word." But deep inside, she couldn't shake the worry that pulsed quietly in her chest. Then, at last, headlights cut through the darkness outside. A car door slammed. The sound of heavy footsteps splashed through puddles, and the front door opened with a gust of cold, wet wind. "Mom!" James's voice echoed through the house. Mrs. Hyen hurried to the door. "James, you're drenched, my dear boy." He stepped inside, rainwater dripping from his coat. His hair clung to his forehead, but the exhaustion on his face softened the moment he saw Diep holding Nia near the fire. "You're both here," he said quietly, relief breaking through his tired tone. "Thank God." Diep stood up quickly. "You shouldn't have driven in this weather. The roads, I had to," he interrupted gently, his eyes locked on hers. "I couldn't sleep knowing you two were out here without me, Mrs." Hyen smiled knowingly as she handed him a towel. "Come, warm yourself. Dinner's waiting." James took the towel, glancing at his mother with a faint smile. "You never change, Mom. Always worrying, always cooking too much," she chuckled. "And soon, I'll be planning more than dinner." James frowned slightly. "What do you mean, Mrs.?" Hyen exchanged a mischievous glance with Diep, who immediately lowered her eyes, pretending to fix Nia's blanket. "Oh, nothing, Mrs." Hyen said casually, stirring the soup. "Just thinking about the future, about family." James raised an eyebrow. "Family, yes," she said softly. "You've worked too hard for too long. Maybe it's time to think about love. Someone who stands beside you, even through the storms." He followed her gaze straight to Diep. For a moment, the world went silent except for the steady rhythm of the rain outside. Diep felt his eyes on her, and her heart fluttered with confusion and warmth. She tried to look away, but his gaze held her like gravity. After dinner, while Mrs. Hyen put Nia to bed, James and Diep stood near the veranda. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the air smelled of wet earth and night flowers. "You shouldn't have worried," Diep said softly, her voice barely above the rain. "We were safe here." James leaned against the wooden post, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't worried about the storm, Diep. I was worried about what might happen if I wasn't there for you." She looked at him. "Startled, James." He smiled faintly. "Mom's idea about a wedding, she's always one step ahead. But maybe she's not wrong to think about it." Her breath caught. The world around them seemed to hold still. The rain, the candlelight flickering through the window, even the faint chirp of crickets all faded into silence. "James, please don't," she whispered. "You don't have to say things just because your mother hopes for them." "I'm not saying it because of her," he replied, his voice low and steady. "I'm saying it because when I saw you standing there tonight with Nia in your arms, waiting through the storm, I realized something." "What?" "That home doesn't mean a house or success or company meetings. It means you." Diep's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes glistened in the dim light. Before she could respond, Mrs. Hyen's voice called softly from inside. "James, Diep, comin', it's cold out there." He smiled, turning away from the night. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said gently. As they walked back inside, Diep's heart pounded with something she couldn't name: hope, fear, love, all tangled together. And behind them, Mrs. Hyen watched quietly from the doorway, a tender smile on her lips. She had seen the look in her son's eyes, and she knew the storm had done something more than bring them together for one night. It had planted the seed of a love she had long wished for. The next morning dawned soft and gray. Mist hung over the fields like a thin white curtain, and raindrops still clung to the window panes of Mrs. Hyen's old house. Inside, the warmth of breakfast filled the air, the scent of rice porridge, ginger tea, and corn freshly steamed by Diep. James sat at the table with a cup of tea in his hand, his gaze lost somewhere in the distance. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Diep's face under the golden light of the night before, her eyes uncertain, her lips trembling as if afraid to believe in hope. James, his mother's voice broke his thoughts. She stood near the kitchen counter, stirring the porridge. "You'll go to the office later." He nodded slowly. "If the roads are clear. There's still damage from the landslide." She said casually. But her eyes carried something more, a quiet plan forming behind them. Diep entered the room carrying Nee, who was half asleep on her shoulder. The sight softened the atmosphere instantly. James rose from his chair without thinking. "Let me take her," he offered. Their fingers brushed as she handed the child to him, a fleeting touch, but enough to make Diep's cheeks warm. Mrs. Hyen watched silently, hiding her smile behind her teacup. Yes, she thought, it's time. Later that day, when James had gone to the company to inspect the flood damage, Mrs. Hyen called a few old friends in the village. Her voice was filled with excitement, though she spoke in whispers. Yes, just something small. A celebration at home. When the weather clears, flowers, maybe white lilies. Diep loves those. No, she doesn't know yet. She chuckled softly. It's a surprise, a love wedding. As she spoke, she looked out the window at Diep and Nee in the garden, helping each other hang damp clothes on a line. The young woman's laughter rose lightly through the morning fog, tender and bright, like a melody that healed old silence. Mrs. Hyen sighed with warmth. She had seen too many storms in life, the kind that tore people apart. James had lost himself once in business wars and long nights at the office, forgetting how to live. But when Diep came, something in him changed. His voice softened, his smile returned. Even the walls of the house, once filled only with loneliness, began to echo with laughter again. So yes, she decided, even if fate hesitated, she would push it forward. By afternoon, the rain had stopped completely. Diep and Nee walked to the nearby market to buy some food. The ground was soft under their feet, and the air smelled of wet grass and smoke. As they walked, people greeted them kindly. "Diep, you sold all your corn yesterday, right? Your little girl's so sweet." Small, simple things that made her smile. But inside, her heart was unsettled. James's words from last night kept echoing in her mind. Home means you. Could he really mean it? She wasn't from his world. She had no wealth, no name, no title. She was just a village girl who once struggled to sell corn in the rain. And he was the man everyone admired, the one who rebuilt his company with sheer will and brilliance. When she returned home, James was already there. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair still damp from the rain. He was helping his mother arrange the dining table. "You came back early," Diep said, surprised. He smiled faintly. The meeting was postponed. The roads are still blocked. As she placed the groceries down, she noticed something strange. A folded invitation card on the table, its edge decorated with gold. Her heart skipped a beat. "And Hyen, what's this?" she asked curiously. Mrs. Hyen turned, startled for a moment, then quickly smiled. "Oh, that? Just a small gathering I'm planning." Diep picked it up. The words, written in elegant handwriting, made her breath catch. "A celebration of love, James and Diep." Her eyes widened. "At this?" Mrs. Hyen reached out gently, her voice soft and full of affection. "My dear, sometimes love needs a little push. You two are meant to be. The storm proved it. You waited for him, and he came through the rain for you. That's not coincidence, that's destiny." Diep froze, her heart pounding. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or run. James, standing nearby, looked at the card, then at his mother, then at Diep. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Mom, you really planned all this?" Mrs. Hyen's eyes twinkled. "I told you, it's time you stopped fighting happiness." The silence that followed was filled with emotions, too deep for words. Diep's eyes glistened, her fingers trembling around the invitation. Was this real? A wedding? Between her and James? And yet, somewhere in her chest, beneath the surprise and the fear, there was something else, something warm, steady, and unspoken: hope. Life often teaches us that love does not arrive with perfection. It arrives with storms, silence, and small moments of faith. Through Diep and James's story, we learn that true love is not about grand weddings, wealth, or social status. It is about understanding, patience, and the courage to stay beside each other when everything seems to fall apart.